Error. When I was still the director of the private Appleset Psychiatric Clinic, we had one interesting patient, and for so long that in time he became, as it were, part of the clinic itself. He was very calm and did not give the staff any trouble, which compares favorably with many others. From the documents it followed that he was with us voluntarily and paid for the treatment himself. He had no close relatives, no one visited him, and only doctors, physiologists and psychiatrists were interested in him, for whom he was an interesting object for research. Before entering the hospital, he was a pastor in a small village, and he was known only to a few parishioners. In our country, he immediately became popular among doctors, although he himself probably did not suspect this. The thing is, this man never slept. However, every night he tried to relax, went to bed and often spent long hours reading. At first he tried to fall asleep, undressed, turned off the light and patiently lay on the bed, but after 5 minutes he jumped up with such a cheerful look as if he had slept the whole night. Then he left these futile attempts and went about his business at night just as he did during the day. We did not see the need to interfere with his round-the-clock voluntary work, and therefore, at his request, even they took the bed out of the room. At night, he not only read, but also wrote a lot, but he never showed these countless written sheets to anyone. At times, he began to exacerbate, he became gloomy and withdrawn, and then disappeared from the hospital, usually at night. From year to year, this happened at the same time, in mid-October, and each time he was found in the same place, in the cemetery of the nearest village of Appleset. We attributed this to the fact that he still remembered his former profession, but the true reasons became clear only after his death. The poor fellow died early, at the 40th year of his life. Obviously, constant insomnia, no matter how interesting it was for doctors, exhausted his body and prematurely aged tissues, although it must be said that he was an extremely strong and large man. In his youth, he certainly stood out among his peers with his mighty build, and I thanked God for endowing this athlete with such a meek disposition. It was simply impossible to imagine how the orderlies would have coped with him if he suddenly began to run amok. But this did not happen, and we were all sincerely saddened to learn of his untimely death. Among his things, which were brought to my office after the funeral, was a large package with scribbled sheets. On the package, next to my name, were the words, "To be opened after my death," in beautiful, even handwriting. Below I pass all this text unchanged as I read it on that gloomy November morning. I was curate at the Church of St. Elpha in the village of Smeriton, and I had an excellent life there. And my happiness would have been completely complete if not for one person, the village headman, retired Admiral Sir Anthony Wilpert. A kind of pathological antipathy immediately arose between us. We just hated each other for no apparent reason. I was sick of just looking at him. He was a lean man with light blue eyes, a whitish mustache and a thin, pointed beard. I even called him to myself, "Little White Goat," he was so frail and pale. When he spoke, his voice sounded not like the powerful rumble of a sailor, but rather like a goat's bleating, and it's hard to even express what disgust he aroused in me. We quarreled and cursed for any reason. And soon I became aware that behind my back he was talking all sorts of nasty things about me to the parishioners, constantly poisoning their minds with the most vile and unceremonious slander. His speeches had a particularly strong effect on young people, and it cost me great efforts to protect my name from dirty gossip and suspicion. I became literally obsessed with this hatred. I thought about him all the time, and these thoughts were unacceptably bloodthirsty. Sitting in my office, I constantly saw his disgusting image in front of me, and in church, during the service, I even had to lower my eyes so as not to meet with his eyes and not stray from prayer. In his eyes, I read a burning desire to do me any harm that a person is only capable of, and this look made me feel uneasy. I fell into sin because every day I mentally killed him, and when after that I read the Holy Scripture aloud, it seemed to me that the parishioners knew about it and looked at me with condemnation. And it also seemed to me that he read my thoughts, and then grinned impudently and contemptuously, looking me straight in the eyes. And then one day a note was brought to my home saying that he was seriously ill. A spark of hope sparkled in my soul. I got ready and went to him, but, thank God, he died before I could cross the threshold of his house. Unheard of joy seized me. Never in my life have I felt so happy. The day of the funeral arrived, and I met the funeral procession at the gates of the mortuary. But as I passed the closed coffin to the church door, I suddenly heard a faint, barely perceptible tapping. My blood froze in my veins when I realized that this sound was coming from the coffin. But I immediately discarded this terrible thought and, gathering all my will into a fist, passed by. It just can't be. All this is my sick imagination. This is the usual noise in the head, or maybe an echo of hatred. As the coffin was being slowly carried to the altar, I again heard the same quiet sound. Then again. And further. Now there could be no doubt. I waited for the porters to hear this knock too, and someone to raise the alarm. Then they will lower the coffin and open it right here in the church. But nothing of the kind happened, and again I distinctly heard this ominous muffled knock, as if a big drum was beating somewhere in the distance. My legs buckled, and if I had not leaned against the wall, I would have lost consciousness for sure. A terrible truth was revealed to me: Vilpert is alive, but only I hear his weak pleas for help. I can't describe my state of mind at the time. I was seized by a terrible feeling of boundless power over him. Here he lies, so helpless, in this coffin, and here, now, I can become his killer. And I will never be found. Thoughts like devilish fire burned my brain. I have mentally killed him so many times, and now I can do it for real, and for this I don't even have to do anything. He is now a prisoner of my ears, and his salvation depends only on my tongue. All his insults, all his slander and hatred towards me, all this closed my mouth with a strong lock and did not allow me to utter a word. It even seemed to me that, as if through a dense fog, I see him in this coffin, as if the lid of the coffin were made of thick glass, a pale, frightened face, eyes rounded with horror, begging me for mercy. And barely restraining my hatred and gloating, I rejected this plea for help and betrayed his worst death, being buried alive. He had to unite with the dead while still alive and live to enter the hellish darkness of eternity. However, after some time, common sense returned to me, and I thought that if no one but me hears this knock, then it is just a figment of my imagination. I calmly and firmly continued to fulfill my duties, and then silently watched as the coffin was lowered into the grave. The day was damp and cold. Autumn mist enveloped the cemetery, casting sad thoughts of death. The clods of earth fell with a dull thud onto the lid of the coffin, and it might have seemed that we were answering his desperate calls from outside. And he, as if having heard this answering sound, was for a moment inspired by a new hope, and the blows from within became louder and more frequent. And I doubted again. Lord, is no one listening? I quickly looked around, but immediately lowered my eyes for fear of betraying my excitement. It all looked like some kind of terrible conspiracy. But then the signals from the coffin began to subside. The last time I heard a knock was when it was already quite weak and began to mix with the soft blows of the falling earth. I turned and walked past the weeping relatives towards the church. I sat in the silence of my office until dusk began to fall outside the window. Then I got up to draw the curtains, and glanced casually at the darkened cemetery yard. Terrible thoughts tormented me. I continued to live, but some incredible weight lay on my heart. I drank tea, wrote several letters, and all this time it seemed to me as if it was no longer me, but someone completely different. It seemed to me that inside my being a tightly coiled spring was waiting in the wings. I went to bed early, at 10 o'clock, but by that time it was quite quiet in the house. My housekeeper that evening took time off to visit relatives in a neighboring village. I locked the front door and went upstairs. I settled comfortably in bed, read for a while, and then fell asleep unnoticed. But soon I woke up with the feeling that I had slept for many hours. I sat up in bed and looked at the clock. Only 10 minutes had passed, but I knew for sure that I would not be able to sleep again. The spring unrolled. I lay down again and lay in the dark for a long time, as if waiting for someone to come, or something to happen. Then I heard the clock on the church strike, and I immediately knew what I had to do. I got up and got dressed. What I had to do, I had to do myself, alone. No help was to be sought. I had to personally know the whole truth, and no one could help me with this. I went downstairs, opened the back door, and stepped out into the cool, damp night. It was quiet and very dark. I went to the shed where the church warden kept his tools, turned on the light, took a shovel and walked to a fresh grave under the trees. At that time I was young and strong, and there was still a whole night left in reserve. The ominous silence of the cemetery was broken only by the sound of drops, occasionally falling from wet leaves. In the darkness, I could barely make out the contours of the church, but after getting used to it a little, I put the lamp I had taken from the house on the ground, took off my coat and began to dig up the earth that covered the coffin with the little white goat. If I made a mistake, then I must make sure of this in order to live peacefully. And if there was no mistake, then it is necessary to quickly correct the evil, and then it will be a very strange meeting of two sworn enemies. One is alive in a coffin, and the other is in the role of a gravedigger. Despite the coolness of the night, I soon began to sweat, and I had to take off my vest, and then my shirt. Every time the clock struck, I shuddered in fear. It seemed to me that they were closely watching my terrible work. Heaps of earth grew up on both sides of the opened grave, and I sank lower and lower into the pit. Finally, the shovel hit the lid of the coffin. I cleared it from the ground, threw the shovel aside and decided to take a break to gather my strength before the most terrible moment. The night enveloped me in thick blackness, and I thought that the whole world now began to look like a grave. I soon realized that it would be very difficult for me to open the coffin alone. Still, I managed to unscrew the screws and, using the shovel as a lever, I finally swung the lid aside. Then took lamp and illuminated what was in the coffin. There lay my enemy, the man I hated so much. Dull yellow rays fell on his face. Strange feelings came over me. At that moment, I fully realized what death really is: black, silent, mysterious, and at the same time amazingly stupid. And I started to laugh. I was unable to contain it, but I did not want to laugh in the presence of the dead. I climbed out of the grave and already there, on the surface, I laughed with all my might, as if all the hatred that had accumulated in me over many years spilled out at that moment. Never before have I worked with such speed and diligence. Some kind of inhuman impulse seized me when I filled up the grave. And all this time I was laughing uncontrollably until I had a pain in my side. How wrong was I anyway? The white goat was dead, but in the coffin he lay on his stomach.